On a moonlit night in medieval Serbia, a young prince vanished from his father's palace without a sound. Horses searched, torches swept the hills, and the grand prince himself demanded answers. But the boy who fled was not escaping danger, he was chasing God. And that single act of defiance would ignite a spiritual revolution, topple political feuds, create a national church, and turn the runaway prince into one of the greatest saints in Eastern Christianity. This is the astonishing story of Saint Sava, the man who left the throne behind to claim a kingdom not of this world. Rasko Nemanjic was born around the year 1174 into a world of armor and banners, a court where the clang of swords mingled with the chants of priests. His father, Grand Prince Stefan Nemanja, ruled with firm but pious hand, restoring unity among the Serbian lands and carving space for them between the powers of Byzantium, Hungary, and the Latin West. Rasko, however, entered that world gently. While other noble sons learned to ride before they could walk and practiced striking dummies with wooden swords, Rasko wandered the orchards with books tucked under his arm. Servants whispered that he spoke more softly to the horses than to the nobles, and he was often found standing still, unnaturally still, staring at the flicker of candles in the palace chapel, as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. His mother, Anna, felt it earliest. She once found him kneeling in the chapel long past midnight, the moonlight cast across the floor like a pale shroud. When she touched his shoulder, he startled, but the look in his eyes was not fear. It was longing, quiet, piercing, radiant longing for something beyond the jeweled ceilings and carved wooden thrones of his father's palace. She would later tell the court priest that the sight had frightened her more than any prophecy or omen. Children usually love the world before them. Rasko seemed to love another one entirely. The tutors noticed it next. They praised his quick mind, his nearly photographic memory for scripture, his ear for languages, but they muttered that he was not made for politics. While his older brother sparred or schemed, Rasko asked questions that unsettled grown men. Why do men kill? Why do kings hunger for land? Why is silence more powerful than victory? One monk from Studenica, assigned to instruct the young prince, recalled finding him in the library, reading the lives of the Desert Fathers. Rasko's finger traced the lines as he whispered aloud of Antony, of Macarius, of those who fled empires to conquer themselves. When the monk gently reminded him that he was a prince, destined for rule, Rasko only smiled and said, "Even princes must answer when God calls." Still, Rasko performed his duties, formally. He learned the art of the bow, though he rarely released an arrow. He studied diplomacy, though he disliked the lies often required. He rode in hunting parties, yet found excuses to break away, returning with herbs instead of game. His childhood was not unhappy. It was simply misaligned with the world expected of him. The court saw a prince who was dutiful, intelligent, and disciplined. But beneath that princely composure, a storm swelled quietly, the kind that changes the course of nations. When Rasko was about 15 or 16, his father sent him to the border province governed by one of Nemanja's trusted nobles, ostensibly to learn the ways of rule. In truth, it was partly an attempt to temper the boy's unworldly inclinations. The province bustled with soldiers, merchants, traders, and farmers, a tapestry of ordinary life. Here, the elders hoped, the young prince would embrace his earthly responsibilities. Instead, this is where the flame within him caught fire. For it was during this period that monks from Mount Athos passed through the region. They came as they often did, seeking alms, carrying news, sometimes gathering supplies before returning to that ancient bastion of silence and prayer. But when Rasko met them, it was as though he recognized them instantly. Their clothing was simple, their hands calloused, their eyes tired from long vigils. Yet something in their presence filled him with a peace he had never felt among noblemen in silk robes. He visited their camp often, bringing bread and wine, asking questions that startled the monks with their depth. One night, As they gathered around a small fire, one of the elder monks recounted a vision he had seen years earlier, a dream of a tall, fair-haired youth standing in the doorway of the great lavra, light pouring behind him as the wind carried the sound of church bells. "I told the abbot it meant nothing," the monk said with a weary smile. "But now, looking at you, young prince, I wonder." Rasko's heart hammered in his chest. He said nothing, but when he returned to his quarters at night, he could not sleep. Every sound in the village felt amplified. The crackle of torches, the murmur of wind, the distant howl of wolves. The world seemed thinner somehow, as though heaven pressed close to earth. When he closed his eyes, he did not see his father's court, or the expectations piled on his shoulders, or the throne that would one day demand his obedience. He saw Athos, its cliffs rising like stone prayers, its monasteries breathing centuries of chant, its forests whispering to those who sought God alone. After that night, nothing was the same. Within weeks, the monks prepared to return to Athos, and Rasko knew, he knew with a certainty more solid than any earthly command, that he must go with them. But he also knew what his departure would mean. His father needed heirs, and Rasko, though the youngest, was one of the most promising. His brothers were warriors. He was a scholar, the diplomat, the peacemaker. Nemanja would not release him easily. And so, with a trembling mixture of devotion and fear, the young prince made his plan in secret. On a night described in family chronicles as unnaturally still, Rasko slipped out of the noble household where he resided. A single guard glimpsed him riding into the darkness, but the prince's swift horse outpaced all pursuers. He met the Athonite monks at the edge of a dense forest, and together they vanished into roads leading toward the sea. When Nemanja learned the next morning that Rasko was gone, the palace erupted in panic. Couriers were sent in all directions. Armed riders galloped toward the coast. The prince's mother wept until she could no longer stand. Nemanja, who had united the Serbian lands by force and faith, found himself powerless before the will of his own son. The chronicles say that he stood for a long time in Rasko's empty chamber, reading the simple letter left on the table. Finally, with a sigh that those nearby remembered as heavy beyond measure, he whispered, "May God go with him, but I will bring him home." The pursuit was swift and fierce, for Nemanja's men had identified the route toward Athos. But when they arrived at the last port before the mountain, they were met not with a prince, but with monk. Rasko had gone to the monastery of Russian monks at Panalimon. There, aware that soldiers were already closing in, he begged to be tonsured immediately. The monks hesitated. Taking the son of a ruling monarch without permission could unleash diplomatic disaster. But Rasko pleaded with such longing, such burning intensity, that they relented. Before dawn, with candles flickering as though stirred by invisible breath, the young prince knelt at the foot of the abbot. His golden hair fell to ground in long, shining strands as the scissors clicked softly through the silence of the chapel. The moment the tonsure was complete, the abbot gave him a new name, Sava. Those present later said that as soon as the name was spoken, the chapel filled with strange stillness, not silence, but a deep hum, as though the stones themselves recognized the transformation. Sava opened his eyes and felt something passing over him, a warm clarity that neither fear nor doubt could pierce. He had crossed the threshold, leaving crowns, wealth, and destiny behind. He was now a monk of Athos. When Nemanja's soldiers arrived shortly after sunrise, they demanded the prince be returned. The abbot gestured toward the newly tonsured monk standing quietly by the iconostasis. "The man you seek no longer exists," he said. "God has claimed him." The soldiers begged, argued, threatened, but they could not drag home a monk who had renounced the world. After sending word back to Serbia, they returned empty-handed, leaving Sava on the sacred mountain he had longed for since childhood. Sava entered Athonite life with an almost frightening intensity. While other novices struggled with the rigor of the services, the fast, the unbroken silence of the night hours. Sava seemed to embrace them as though he had been shaped for this life in his mother's womb. The monks marveled that he never complained, never lost focus, never asked for privileges despite his royal origin. He swept floors with quiet reverence, served at the trapeze with humility, and memorized long passages of scripture with breathtaking ease. One of the elders noted in his memoir that Sava's prayer often took on a mystical quality. During vigils, the young monk would stand motionless for hours, his face illuminated by candle glow, his eyes unfocused as though peering into eternity. Once, when a novice accidentally dropped a censer, sending coals tumbling across the floor, Sava did not flinch. He did not even blink. Afterward, the elder asked him what he had been contemplating so deeply. The young monk lowered his eyes shyly and said, "I saw only a light, steady and gentle, filling the heart." The elder pressed no further. Mystical experiences were not rare on Athos, but in Sava's case they seemed to come naturally, as though grace found him with little effort. He moved from monastery to monastery, learning from the greatest spiritual fathers of the mountain. From Vedapiti he learned obedience. From great Lavra, the depth of contemplative prayer. From Iveron, the art of spiritual counsel. Years passed in this rhythm of silence and asceticism, yet Sava felt no desire to leave. Athos had become the home of his soul. But while Sava had renounced the world had not renounced him. Back in Serbia, Nemanja grew older. His lands prospered, his sons sharpened their ambitions, and the question of succession grew dangerous. The old ruler, wise in politics and faith, realized that he needed Sava not merely as a son, but as a spiritual anchor for the dynasty. And so the father who once sent soldiers to seize his runaway child prepared instead for a pilgrimage. He would go to Mount Athos himself. What happened when father and son met again on the holy mountain would change both of their lives, and the future of Serbia forever. The journey of Grand Prince Stefan Nemanja to Mount Athos was spoken of by merchants, monks, and travelers for decades afterward, not because of its political weight, though that was considerable, but because of the strange atmosphere that seemed to surround the old ruler as he traveled. Some swore the weather changed around him, storms receding as he approached villages, winds softening at his passing. Others whispered that he walked not like a king, but like a man preparing for a final reckoning. His beard had grown long and silver, his eyes deepened with age, and he carried himself with the solemnity of one who had spent a lifetime wrestling with the fate of nations and had at last glimpsed the truth. Kingdoms rise and fall, but the soul alone endures. He reached Athos after a difficult sea crossing, stepping onto the rocky shore with the help of 2 monks. The sea wind tugged at his cloak, yet when he straightened himself, there was still something of the old majesty in him. The monks bowed deeply, for even here, in the sanctuary that emperors respected and armies feared, Nemanja's name held weight. But he held up a hand and said softly, "No bows. I come not as prince, but as father." They led him to Vedapiti Monastery, where Sava had been residing for several years. The bells tolled as the gates opened, and Nemanja entered the courtyard. He expected to see immediately the son he had lost and released, but the monks told him Sava was still in prayer at the chapel. The prince waited beneath a vine-covered walkway, hands clasped tightly, breath uneven. He had faced rebels, foreign kings, treacherous nobles, and armies many times larger than his own, but nothing had ever filled him with such trembling anticipation. At last, the chapel door opened. Sava stepped out carrying a candle, unaware that his father had arrived. He moved slowly, deep in contemplation, the flame casting warm light on his serene features. He was leaner now, his face sharpened by fasting and prayer, yet there remained in him a gentleness that had been present since childhood. When he lifted his eyes and saw the old man before him, he froze. For a moment neither spoke. The wind rustled the vine leaves overhead, and the candle flickered. Then Sava's voice, quiet, trembling, broke the silence. "Father?" Nemanja stepped forward and placed both hands on his son's face, as though confirm he was real. Tears filled his eyes, but he fought to keep his voice steady. "I came to bring you home once," he murmured, "but now I come to join you." Sava fell to his knees and pressed his forehead to his father's hands. The monks witnessing the scene later wrote that they had never before felt such grace settle over the courtyard. A prince and a monk, father and son, reunited not through force, but through surrender to the same divine call. In the days that followed, Sava and Nemanja spent hours walking the shaded paths around the monastery, speaking not of politics or power, but of prayer, humility, and salvation. Nemanja confessed the burdens he carried, battles fought, harsh judgments rendered, ambitions he once nurtured but now regretted. Sava listened with compassion, speaking softly of forgiveness, of the mercy that waits even for kings, and of the peace he himself had found in the silence of Athos. One evening, as they stood before the icon of the Theotokos, Nemanja said plainly, "I will not return to Serbia as ruler. My sons will govern the land. You must guide them, Sava, not with a sword, but with the word of God." And in that moment, without hesitation, the great prince laid aside the crown that had defined his life. Soon after, he took monastic vows at Vedapiti, receiving the name Simeon, a name that would echo through Serbian history like a promise. Sava and Simeon lived together on Athos, father and son united in prayer. Their bond deepened through the monastic rhythms, rising before dawn, chanting the psalms, laboring in the fields, eating simple meals, spending long nights in vigil. Simeon, once a sovereign whose commands ruled thousands, now carried buckets of water and chopped firewood. Sava watched him with awe, moved by the transformation of a man who had renounced everything for Christ. But their life on Athos was only the beginning of a greater mission. For years, the Serbian presence on a holy mountain had been dispersed, monks wandering from monastery to monastery, lacking a home of their own. Sava felt a stirring in his heart, a sense that God intended something more for their people. And so, father and son petitioned the Byzantine emperor and the Athonite council for permission to restore an abandoned monastery. They were granted the ancient site of Hilandar, a crumbling ruin nestled among the northern forests of Athos. What happened next became legend. Sava threw himself into rebuilding Hilandar with an energy that startled even seasoned monks. He climbed scaffolding, hauled stones, prepared timber, and oversaw every detail from the shape of the chapel windows to the carving of the iconostasis. Simeon, though aged, worked beside him. Sometimes the monks would find him sitting among the ruins, whispering prayers with his hands placed on stones, as though blessing each one. The workers often said that he did not build the monastery, he consecrated it. During the construction, several miraculous events were recorded. One night, when the lamps had nearly burned out and the workers feared they would need to stop until more oil could be brought from Vedapiti, an inexplicable brightness filled the courtyard. They looked around for torches, for lanterns, for moonlight, yet none were present. The light seemed to rise from the ground itself, illuminating the walls until the work could continue. The monks later described it as a grace light, neither sun nor flame. Another time, when the supply of wood ran dangerously low, Sava led a small group into the forest to search for fallen timber. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and some of the workers whispered that they felt watched by unseen presences. But Sava walked calmly. When they reached the clearing, they found a massive oak that had fallen in the night, perfectly dry, perfectly straight, as though laid down deliberately. Sava traced his fingers along the trunk and said simply, "The Lord provides for his house." By the year 1198, Hilandar stood restored, a shining beacon of Serbian faith on Athos. Its walls were smooth and white. Its roof gleamed with new tiles, and its chapel echoed with chants that rose like incense toward the heavens. Father and son lived there in harmony, Simeon's days growing quieter, Sava's responsibilities deepening. Pilgrims from Serbia began arriving seeking counsel. Letters poured in from nobles and clergy needing guidance. Sava responded to each one, his heart torn between love for the monastic silence and duty toward his homeland. In early 1199, Simeon fell ill. It was not a sudden illness, but a gentle weakening, as though a candle flickered low after burning long and faithfully. Sava stayed constantly at his bedside, reading the Psalms aloud, preparing warm broth, adjusting the blankets. Simeon often reached for his son's hand and whispered, "You must shepherd our people, Sava, build not only monasteries of stone, but monasteries of hearts." In February 1199, Simeon passed peacefully into eternal life. The monks wrote that the air around his cell filled with the scent of fresh basil, though none grew in the winter cold. Sava wept, not as a prince nor as an abbot, but as a son. He kept vigil for 3 days, barely speaking, barely sleeping, standing in prayer beside his father's body. When Simeon was finally laid to rest in Hilandar's chapel, Sava knelt so long before the tomb that the marble beneath him grew warm from his tears, though grief weighed heavily on him. Sava soon understood what Simeon had foreseen. Serbia was falling into dangerous conflict. His 2 older brothers, Vukan and Stefan, were locked in a bitter struggle for control of the realm. Letters arrived pleading for Sava to return and end the feud before bloodshed tore their father's legacy apart. Sava resisted at first. Athos was his refuge, his calling. But one night, as he stood before the icon of Christ, he felt a sudden stillness descend upon him. A voice, gentle, unmistakable, seemed to stir in his heart. "Go, heal them." And so, in 1207, Sava left Athos carrying with him the relics of his father, Saint Simeon. His journey back to Serbia was marked by profound signs. At one coastal village, a storm threatened to delay them for days. But as soon as the monks carrying Simeon's reliquary stepped onto the dock, the clouds split open and the waters grew calm. Sailors crossed themselves in awe, whispering that the saint guided their path. When Sava finally arrived at Sedenica Monastery, Stefan's stronghold, the conflict between the brothers was near breaking point. Rumors spread that Sava had returned with his father's relics, and crowds flocked to the monastery. The moment Sava entered the church carrying the reliquary, an overwhelming hush filled the space. Stefan collapsed to his knees, weeping openly. Even Vukan, stubborn, proud, unbending, lowered his head in shame. Sava placed the reliquary before the altar and spoke with gentle authority. "Our father was a builder of peace. Shall his sons be destroyers of it?" The brothers embraced, their years of bitterness dissolving in a single moment. Chroniclers wrote that Sava performed not a miracle of healing, but a miracle of unity, the kind that saves nations rather than bodies. For the next decade, Sava dedicated himself to healing the spiritual life of Serbia. He reformed monasteries, standardized liturgical practices, taught clergy to serve with humility, and established new centers of learning. His voice carried weight not because he ruled, but because he had renounced rule. When he preached, crowds grew hushed, sensing that the words came not from ambition, but from a place of profound communion with God. But his greatest mission still lay ahead. By 1219, Serbia faced a critical challenge. To remain spiritually dependent on foreign patriarchates meant perpetual vulnerability. The land needed an independent church, one that could anoint kings, guide the people, and ensure stability. The only man capable of securing such a monumental achievement was Sava. And so, he set forth once more, this time to the great city of Nicaea, where exiled Byzantine emperors and patriarchs held court after the fall of Constantinople to the Crusaders. Sava entered the imperial chambers not in royal robes, but in the simple garments of a monk. Yet emperors bowed their heads. Patriarchs greeted him warmly, and the court spoke of him with reverence. Those in attendance later recalled that when he spoke of Serbia's need for independence, a certain radiance seemed to surround him, as though he bore the authority of more than petitioner, as though he bore God's own peace. The patriarch granted Sava what no Serbian had ever received: the creation of an autocephalous Serbian Church, and Sava himself was consecrated as its first archbishop. Witnesses said that when the patriarch placed the omophorion on Sava's shoulders, the candles around the altar flared suddenly, burning steadier and brighter than before. Sava had ascended not a throne, but a cross, a burden that would shape the rest of his life. The day Saint Sava returned from Nicaea as archbishop of the newly independent Serbian Church, crowds poured into the roads leading to Studenica and Zika. It was as though the entire land had awakened at once, hearing that the monk who had fled a royal youth had now returned not with sword or crown, but with something far greater: spiritual sovereignty, a new beginning for a people often torn between empires. Villagers threw flowers along the paths. Children ran beside the horses. Old men wept without shame. Sava rode quietly, humbled by the attention. He had never sought authority, yet authority clung to him like light to water. When he dismounted at the gates of Studenica and raised his hand in blessing, the multitude fell to their knees. Several chroniclers later wrote that at that moment a white dove circled above the monastery, settling briefly upon the dome before taking flight again. They took it as a sign. The Spirit had settled upon Serbia. But for Sava, the work was only beginning. He immediately began strengthening the foundations of the Serbian Church with a clarity of vision rarely seen in medieval rulers, much less monks. He established dioceses in strategic regions, ensuring that the spiritual structure of the land matched its political boundaries. He appointed bishops not for their birth or influence, but for their humility, learning, and dedication to prayer, men shaped as he had been on Athos, men who would shepherd rather than command. One of his earliest acts was the consecration of Hilandar Monastery as the seat of the archbishopric. Sava oversaw every part of its construction, from the layout of the church to the murals that would one day guide the devotion of generations. Artists from Constantinople painted the walls with scenes from Scripture, but Sava himself guided the theological symbolism. He wanted the people of Serbia, not just monks, to feel embraced by the beauty of God. When the church was completed, he invited his brother Stephen, now king, to kneel before the new altar, where he crowned him with ceremonial rites that affirmed both earthly authority and divine blessing. It was the first Serbian coronation performed by a Serbian archbishop, a gesture that sealed the independence won through prayer, diplomacy, and divine providence. Yet Sava's genius extended far beyond church organization. He traveled constantly through mountains and valleys, visiting villages where priests rarely reached, bringing teaching, healing, and reconciliation. People greeted him not as a distant ecclesiastical ruler, but as a father, a man who understood the suffering of shepherds, the worries of mothers, the hidden sins of warriors. His sermons were simple, yet filled with fire. More than once, entire assemblies fell into silence so deep that the crackling of torches sounded like thunder. Miracles accompanied him, though rarely did he acknowledge them. In one mountain village, a drought had scorched the fields. The farmers feared the winter would bring famine. Sava, hearing their worries, asked the villagers to gather before the small wooden chapel. He prayed not with dramatic gestures, but with the same quiet intensity that had marked his earliest days on Athos. Witnesses said that as he prayed, a faint mist rose from the ground, and before nightfall the sky darkened with clouds. By morning, rain fell steadily across the valley. God is kind, Sava said simply, refusing credit for the miracle. Another time, as he was crossing a narrow cliffside path with a group of monks, one brother lost his footing on the gravel and fell into the ravine below. The monks cried out, expecting to see the man's body shattered on the rocks. But instead, they saw him suspended halfway down the slope, his fall inexplicably slowed, as though an unseen hand held him. The monks scrambled back up, shaken yet unharmed. When he reached the path, he fell at Sava's feet, insisting that it was Sava's prayer that had saved him. Sava shook his head gently. "The Lord protect his servants. I am only a witness to his mercy." But not all his work took place among the poor. Sava navigated delicate diplomatic relationships with Byzantines, Bulgarians, Hungarians, and even distant Latin powers. His mastery of languages, Greek, Slavic, some Latin, allowed him to move between worlds divided by suspicion and war. Many rulers found him disarming, expecting a stern ecclesiastic only to encounter a man who listened before he spoke, who asked probing questions, who sought peace rather than advantage. One memorable encounter occurred when Sava met the Bulgarian ruler Boril, whose reign had been troubled by internal revolt. Boril at first received Sava with suspicion, fearing Serbian interference. But after hours of conversation, Sava speaking softly of justice, humility, and the healing of wounds, Boril broke down in tears. "I have ruled with fear," he confessed, "but you govern without ruling at all." Sava's influence brought temporary calm to a land racked by discord, and chroniclers later said that even Boril admitted, "This monk is stronger than any army." Despite his achievements, Sava's heart remained restless. He longed for quiet he had left on Athos, the nights of stillness and pure prayer, the solitude where God's voice was clearest. But he also felt the pressing burden of guiding a young nation still vulnerable to division. The weight had become heavier since Stefan's death and the ascension of Radoslav, whose rule was not as stable. Troubles brewed among the nobles. Foreign influences tugged at the kingdom. Murmurs of rebellion whispered to the mountain passes. It was during this time of growing tension that Sava resolved to undertake a great pilgrimage to the Holy Land itself. Some advisers tried to dissuade him. "Serbia needs you," they warned. "This is not the time to travel." But Sava understood something they could not. The church he had founded could not mature if it depended too much on him. He needed to step away so that the bishops he had trained could learn to lead without him. And so, in 1229, carrying only a small retinue, he journeyed to Palestine. The Holy Land was under the uneasy governance of Latin crusaders who had negotiated partial control through Emperor Frederick II. Sava arrived not as a partisan of East or West, but as a pilgrim, and his humility earned him respect from both sides. The Franciscans welcomed him warmly. The Orthodox monks embraced him as a brother. He spent long nights in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, praying before the site of Christ's resurrection. Witnesses said that at times he remained motionless for so long that candles burned out beside him. One night, while praying alone before Golgotha, he felt a sudden warmth flood his heart, a sensation so intense it brought him to tears. He later described it to a monk as a fire that did not burn but healed. Shortly after, he arranged the founding of a Serbian hospice in Jerusalem, offering shelter to pilgrims from his homeland. The records of the Holy City mention his generosity, noting that he personally served the sick and washed the feet of beggars who wandered into the hospice courtyard. His pilgrimage continued to Sinai, Antioch, and Alexandria. Everywhere he went, he strengthened the bonds between Christian communities, leaving behind a reputation as a peacemaker and bridge builder. When he finally returned to Serbia, the people rejoiced, believing he would resume leadership of the church. But Sava had a different plan. He summoned the bishops to Zika and told them he intended to resign as archbishop and appoint his disciple, Arsnij, as successor. The monks and clergy protested, but Sava explained gently, "A tree grows weak if it depends on a single root. It must learn to stand with many." His decision was unprecedented, but he carried out calmly and with complete detachment. Once Arsnij was enthroned, Sava embraced him as a father embraces a son. Yet Sava still felt called to serve, not from the seat of power, but from the wandering path of a pilgrim once more. In 1234, he set out on another journey, this time toward the east. Constantinople, the Holy Land again, then Egypt. Despite his age, he traveled with vigor. Chroniclers remark on his endurance, noting that he often preferred to walk rather than ride, even across harsh terrain. He visited monasteries in Cairo, prayed in the ancient churches of Alexandria, and encouraged communities struggling under shifting political rule. It was during this final pilgrimage that he fell ill. After traveling through the Middle East, he stopped in the Bulgarian city of Tarnovo to rest at the court of King Ivan Asen II. The king received him with deep reverence, for the fame of the saint had spread widely across the Balkans. Sava prayed daily in the royal church, spoke words of consolation to the court, and blessed the sick who came to him in long lines. But the years of travel and fasting had weakened his body, and a sudden chill settled upon him. Even ill, he radiated peace. One evening, he asked to be left alone in the church for prayer. A servant who later checked on him reported seeing a faint glow near the altar, soft, pulsing, like the light of a candle, though no candles were burning. When the servant approached, the glow disappeared, and Sava was found kneeling in silence, too weak to rise. The next night, sensing that his journey was ending, Sava whispered to the monks attending him, "Do not fear. A servant returns to his master." His breath grew slower, his eyes gentler. He asked for the gospel book, kissed it, and closed his eyes. Before dawn, Saint Sava of Serbia passed into the eternal kingdom he had sought since youth. The monk said that at the moment of his passing, the fragrance of myrrh filled the chamber, so strong that the guards outside smelled it as well. Bells in the nearby church began to ring on their own, though no hand touched them. His death shook the Balkan lands. Serbia mourned its shepherd. Athos mourned its spiritual son. The East and West alike honored a man who had sought peace among all. His body was returned to Mount Athos Monastery, where miracles soon took place at his tomb, healings, visions, consolations. Pilgrims flocked from distant regions to pray where he lay. But more than his relics, it was his legacy that transformed Serbia. A church firmly rooted in orthodoxy, a nation unified by spiritual identity, and a tradition of learning, art, and monastic life that shaped the centuries to come. Saint Sava, the prince who fled a kingdom, became the father of a people, and the echo of his footsteps, quiet, prayerful, unwavering, still lingers in the mountains of Serbia, in the halls of Hilandar, and in every heart that seeks God not through power, but through peace.